Hello and welcome to the European Forum Alpbach 2018. I think it's great that you're here. And let's officially and together say hello to the mayor of Alpbach, to Markus Bischofer. There he is. And to the vice governor of Tirol, Ingrid Philippe. This year's theme, as you all know, is diversity and resilience. Resilience has become a buzzword lately. Not only our bodies, but our mental states are supposed to be resilient and work properly. If they don't, you need to take a short break and then get back on track. Also, companies, societies, and states are expected to be resilient. The admiration for resilience, is very understandable, but there is a risk that lies within that. Because it hands over the responsibility to the individual person, company, state. So let's say your leg is broken or your heart is broken. You are the one who's responsible because you're not resilient enough to get up and go on with your life. Same thing for companies and states and societies. So of course you could argue that the concept of resilience does not blame the victim. Especially if you look at the history of resilience, you will find a very, very interesting story about an Israeli-US sociologist called Aaron Antonovsky. He wanted to find out, after the Holocaust, why some people are, as you could expect them to be, broken, and others are full of lust for life and joy and actually very, very creative and very sharp and very bright, get lots of prizes and stuff like that. So how come some make it and some don't, right? So he interviewed his parents, and he interviewed a lot of other people who survived the Holocaust. And his answer is called salutogenese. And salutogenese is a concept that sees health not as a condition, but as a process. So he thinks that there are risks in life, like overstepping a certain level of bad stress, and there are protective factors like feeling coherent, and there is an interplay between the two of them. But I don't want to bore you any longer with my affinity for Aaron Antonovsky. You could read about him if you want. Instead, I'm going to ask someone on stage who needs no introduction at all, especially not here, the president of the European Forum Alpbach, Franz Fischler. But you know what? I think I'll call him. Okay, he can't be that far, right? If you hear this kind of music, he can't be that far. Here he is.
Welcome to the European Forum Alpbach 2018, also from my side. Dear seminar leaders, dear scholars, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As President of the European Forum Alpbach, I would like to welcome you all most warmly to the Festival of Ideas here in Alpbach. For ourselves, as presenters, it is a great pleasure to be able to host more than 5,000 guests from 100 states at a total of 200 different events over the next 17 days. I would like to offer a special welcome to the Nobel Prize laureate for economics, Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph Stiglitz will open this year's forum. I greet all the researchers, seminar leaders and moderators. Welcome to the Tyrolean Alps. I'm particularly pleased that we have here so many young people amongst our guests. Around 700 students from almost, or from more than 90 countries even, have come to Alpbach to investigate a variety of academic subjects which we offer in 22 seminars, ranging from climate science, biology, and the latest developments in medicine, to questions of the future of Europe, sustainability, and our education systems. We will also ensure that emotional and creative education will not be neglected. One of our greatest ambitions is to include artists in our program, and in the coming weeks they will share their ideas and visions for a modern European society and discuss them with us. At this point, I would like to offer a special welcome to the artist Deborah Sengel. We are proud of the fact that you are presenting your highly acclaimed exhibition, The Last Days of Mankind, here at the Forum. An exhibition that focuses on Karl Kraus' historic literary work and transposes it into our time. No other writer captured the mood of the First World War like Karl Kraus. You, Mrs. Sengel, have responded to this text with unmistakable flair and given the protagonists of his work an entirely new form. In doing so, you have successfully combined history, literature, and art with the present days. Ladies and gentlemen, 100 years ago, the First World War ended, and 100 years ago, the Democratic Republic of Austria was proclaimed. You may ask yourselves, what does that, the foundation of the Republic of Austria and the new European order after the First World War, have to do with Alpbach and the overall theme, diversity and resilience? Let me expand briefly. You all know that diversity is a multifaceted theme. In first instance, it means something like multiplicity. As a sociological concept, it has its roots in the US civil rights movement, and it includes equality of opportunity. Diversity stands for overcoming discrimination against people. Equality of opportunity is essential when we speak about diversity because, in my view, it underlines the positive potential that lies within diversity. In nature, in economy and science, diversity also proves to be a source of innovation, a spirit of inquiry and enterprise. And for us in Europe, I would argue diversity is our treasure. Think about the cultural wealth, the richdom of languages, landscapes, traditions, ideas, or experiences. This is what we mean by diversity. This gives us strength. So we are well advised if we do everything we can to keep or even increase our diversity. This makes us strong, not only towards other continents, but even more to deal successfully with the unknowns of the future, be it the consequences of climate change, digitalization, or artificial intelligence or sustainability. At this point, I do not wish to leave unsaid that diversity also contains challenges in terms of culture, religion, or worldview. But the danger of individual disadvantage, for example, can be addressed directly by equality of opportunity. The plurality of perspectives, ways of life, values, worldviews, attitudes, and principles can lead to a form of overload. Diversity, and this is demonstrated by the present, can be abused in order to incite fear. And then diversity soon acquires a negative aftertaste. Just think of the terms that are currently being used by opinion makers and politicians to refer to refugees and migration. Here the talk is about masses, about crisis, about reception centers, about upper limit, etc. All this is aimed at dehumanizing people and creating fear. We at the European Forum Alpbach wish to resist this and send a strong signal in favor of an open society, in favor of diversity and tolerance. The only constant in life is change. This famous quotation by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus remains just as valid as it was 2,500 years ago. Changes and social upheaval are as much part of human life as the air we breathe. Change should not irritate us or throw us off course. Even when digitalization has led to a situation where the speed of the process of change gives it a new dimension, how do we deal with this acceleration? And how do we deal with these crises associated with it? This is where resilience comes into play. It is well known that resilience denotes our ability to deal with change. Nature reacts to developments such as climate change with, for example, heat waves, floods and mudslides. Politicians react to migratory and refugee movements with increasing isolation. Laws are made more severe and all methods of surveillance have increased. The fact that the freedom of the individual is repeatedly reduced is wiped off the table by the demand for greater security. When we look at the current political circumstances, whether it is Trump in the US, Great Britain's Brexit, the strengthening of right-wing populists, then I have to conclude that our societies are becoming progressively more vulnerable and less resilient to attacks from outside. Whether these are against democracy or against our European values, it is a must for all of us to resist this. Resilience does not mean simply passively accepting reality. Resilience is rather the acknowledgement of social responsibility by taking an active part in shaping realities. Doing this requires intensive debate between all parts of society, advancements of our democratic systems, and a rethinking of our rules and laws. But let us be clear, to achieve all this, we need a new form of engagement. Engagement by every one of us, because we can only make progress if we strengthen much more the cohesion of our societies. And I invite you all to join in. Take an active part in our debates and discussions and make your point. The aim of this year's forum can be expressed in one simple image. if I want to achieve objectives such as stability, robustness, sustainability, then this will only succeed if the tasks of our society are carried on many shoulders. Thank you.
Now let me ask another person who needs no introduction up here, the managing director of the Forum, Philippe Naval. Ich werde übergehen, wenn ich darf. Hello. Mr. Fischler, you just spoke about an open society and about a treasure called diversity in Europe, and you're bringing more than 700 young people here almost every year for a couple of years now already. Why are you inviting these people here?
Well, there are several reasons why we invite this young generation, or in other words, the future generation, because first of all, they are the future and we rely on them. Second, I think that it is really necessary to engage in discussions and dialogue. And this is what we offer. We offer here a platform for exchange of views and ideas, and therefore we call our forum in the meantime also the Festival of Ideas. And thirdly, I think it is good that we give the young people here some hints in what way they can engage, and also some caveats where there are the risks of the future, so that they can be more easily resilient and diverse.
Philippe Naval, you and your wonderful team have worked on this program for many, many months, very intensely. What are your expectations for this year?
Well, apart from a fantastic program, which I hope you will enjoy over the coming 2.5 weeks, I expect personal growth for all of us. Personal growth that comes from finding and seeking out opinions that differ to yours, your personal ones. I've always most benefited from those discussions at the Alpbach Forum where people went of my opinion, especially in a day and age where we tend to segregate in these echo chambers in social media. And to be frank, personal growth specifically in the wonderful team you mentioned, because every forum is a challenge. It's a very specific challenge for those 100 people. And if Eric just wants to put up the slide just that you see them, because many of them are working tirelessly right now behind the scenes to make this work. And I would like to ask you to give a big applause to this wonderful team. And if you allow me, because the clapping is working wonderfully, an extra special applause for my colleague Lara, who is actually organizing the seminar week, but had a little tiny accident. She's already on the way back from hospital, but can't be with us right now, so an extra little cheer for her.
Mr. Fischler, you just talked about diversity being a treasure and making societies more stable. Is that your recipe? Is that the answer?
Well, I warn a bit against recipes. I think what is needed is reflection primarily, and not so much recipes. The conclusion is up to all the individuals here, so they themselves have to find the right answer to the challenges, but also to the offers which are available. And in that way, I think we will be able to make the necessary progress in our societies.
Philippe, you just wrote a book because you are deeply involved with democracies. The book is called Die freundliche Revolution, wie wir gemeinsam die Demokratie retten. let me try to translate that. The friendly revolution, would you call it that? How we're going to rescue democracy? What could you say? Excuse me. The liberal democracy, sorry. So liberal democracy. So what is it you're saying? Every single one of us can change, can make change. What is it every single person in this room could do?
Well, first of all, the amazing thing is, and as I did with the book, when you look out for pioneers that are defending democracy or innovating democracy in Europe, it's amazing that it happens at every level, from a communal and villages where people focus on citizen participation to the very top level of national governments, as recently with the Citizen Assembly in Ireland. But even very young people can actively get engaged, as the story of the Opération Libero, the Operation Libero in Switzerland shows, where a small group of 5 students got together a couple of years ago to form a campaigning platform to defend the Swiss constitution against the sort of populist onslaught. I think that's also an opportunity for growth in Alpbach, to seek out those pioneers and change makers and figure out for yourself, where is my room for maneuver? Where can I make a difference every day? But we've also prepared a special event during the Forum Alpbach where you're all cordially invited to sort of become ambassadors. And if Eric can show the second slide, it has the details on it. We called it My Europe, My Story. The basis is the firm belief that it's sometimes really boring, except if you're Franz Fischler, because he's really cool at it, when you talk about all these parliaments and institutions. But everyone, all of you, are passionate about one thing, and you'll be seeking it out in the seminar week, in the symposium, and everything else. Why don't we leave Alpbach with those stories we feel passionate about, the content you've taken from the seminars, from the symposia, and you just initiate conversations. You go to the old people's home of your granny or your former school, or to a factory, and start a debate, bringing some piece of information about what you feel, what you've learned, and perhaps put it into the context of Europe. And as a little treat for those people who are going to be part of that movement, we've brought some of the best storytelling experts, people who really know and who work on a daily business in media and television, and who know how to tell a good story, to teach you on that day as well. So I'm looking forward for sort of a sign-up and for a great show when we meet in Hauptschule, in the gym in Alpbach, and create a movement coming out of Alpbach.
I think the secret here is this. If we don't look only on the individual engagement, if we bring people together, if we form communities, if we support dialogue, then we will see that 1 + 1 is more than 2. And this is what we need.
Okay, one last question to the both of you, because you're very Alpbach experienced, and 3 weeks here can be a challenge. What's your personal advice to get through this forum for 3 weeks here?
Well, I don't have many advices to all of you. One advice would be curious. I think this is really, and go to with an open mind to the different events which we are offering. Another advice would be engage also with others, what I said before. And the third advice would be have fun. And what that means you will hear later on.
Everybody can decide their own, you mean?
I would just add carbohydrates, hydration, and
Sleep?
sleep. Well, some people can do with little. That's an individual thing. But one thing for sure, do battle your own fear of missing out. We call it FOMO. I had that in the beginning, in the first year. I was like, oh my God, I'm missing that session because I have to finish that email. The place you're in is the right place. And at some point, you'll need a break. Take a walk. Hang out with friends. You can't take it all in for 3 weeks. It does quite get intense. Fear of missing out is something that will catch you, and you will manage to overcome it.
Thank you very much. Franz Fischler, Philipp Nawal. Thank you. So they really balanced out some patchy information situation there, because FOMO, I wouldn't have known about that. And asymmetric information can be very, very tricky, especially in economics and in business. Let's say you want to buy a used car. If you want to buy a used car, you really have to trust the person you're buying the car from. Unless you're really an expert in used cars, but most people aren't. So that's an asymmetric information situation. And the economist who researched about asymmetric information and who actually challenged mainstream economics, believing in perfect markets and perfect information, he even received the Nobel Prize for it. And he's here today, and he will speak to you very, very soon. He'll pick up the two words, diversity and resilience, and he'll take us on a little trip into economics and sociology. So buckle up and enjoy the ride. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joseph Stiglitz, Columbia professor.
I'll sit. No, we'll sit during the cookup. This is okay now. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And the topic is a very challenging one. And I'm going to begin talking about economics for the obvious reason. It's the subject I know best. But I want to suggest that there are a lot of lessons from economics that apply to other subjects. So let me begin. It has been a decade since the global financial crisis of 2008. The loss from this crisis was enormous. It's estimated the cumulative loss on the two sides of the Atlantic are more than 10 trillion euros. And I don't know what your bank accounts are like, but 10 trillion euros is a lot of money. And I hope all of you get it when you grow up. America is finally recovering, but only on the back of unprecedented peacetime and non-recessionary deficit. We already had a deficit relative to our GDP of about 3%, which would be the European maximum. And then in December 2017 and January 2018, the Trump administration essentially doubled the deficit to GDP ratio. If we were in Europe, we would be in the doghouse. We should be in the doghouse even if we're not in Europe, but unfortunately we're not. But as I said, growth has been really slow to recover. It's clear that we were not resilient. There is an argument, which I will come to a little later, that if we had had more diversity in our financial system, actually in our economic system, we would have been more resilient. But the point I want to make is to highlight the importance of resilience and the link between diversity and resilience. We have paid a high price for our lack of resilience, and we need to think more about the measures by which we can achieve greater resilience. I will talk about, as I said before, resilience and diversity in many spheres, in ecosystems, in national security, and our public life. But I will repeatedly come back to economics. But at first I want to talk about a prior issue, which is the exposure to risk, especially large risks. Over the past 40 years, we have restructured our economy, presumably to enhance efficiency and growth. We have often, alas, failed to do that, but in the process, we have enhanced vulnerability, the likelihood of being hit by a shock, the likelihood that that shock will be amplified, and our capacity to respond to the shock, our resilience. Global economic integration, especially in financial market integration, has resulted, especially developing countries, being more exposed to problems originating from abroad. Most of the shocks which they experience are not shocks which originate from their economy, but shocks that originate from outside. The largest example was the crisis of 2008, where mismanagement of the financial markets in the United States affected everyone in the world. On both sides of the Atlantic, we have allowed our banks to get bigger, and we have loosened regulation. Too big to fail, under-regulated banks predictably undertook excessive risk, and we have seen the consequences. As banks engaged in risky products, CDSs, derivatives, as they engaged in risk with each other, we created an ever more interlinked system, which meant a problem in one part of the system quickly was transmitted everywhere. We made the whole system more vulnerable. We increased systemic risk, and we increased systemic risk especially where it mattered when exposed to large, what we call in economics, correlated risks. At the same time, we have changed the structure of the economy in ways that often make it more difficult to cope with the shocks and we've made the economy less resilient to any shocks that arrive. For instance, on both sides of the Atlantic, we have weakened safety nets and systems of social protection. These are an essential part of our social system that protect us and make our system more resilient. We have weakened what economists call automatic stabilizers. These are ways, as soon as the economy goes down, more money goes into the economic system to help bring it back. Our systems of social protection and safety and our safety nets are important examples of automatic stabilizers. So is the unemployment insurance system. And we have shifted the burden of risk to workers and weakened other aspects of our social protection system. Workers are not in the best position to manage risks. Others are, society and our corporations. But because of ideology, we have shifted risk to where it shouldn't be, and we have made our system more vulnerable and less resilient. In Europe, the euro took away two of the key instruments of adjustment, the interest rate and the exchange rate, and they put nothing in its place, making Europe less resilient. The low capital requirements imposed on banks meant that they were less resilient. A large shock could and did push them over the edge and would have if the government had not come to the rescue. That raises a more general point. As we thought we were getting better at managing risk, our banks lived more and more at the edge. They were pushing the envelope, but living at the edge means that when one confronts a big shock, one often goes over the edge. There's another general point. Too often we focus on short-term gains, ignoring long-term risks. We ignore the exposure to a shock, one's vulnerability, the impacts on resilience. It's hard to assess those, but it's easy to see the short-term gains. But that's a big mistake, often, as we've seen in the 2008 crisis, with enormous consequences. The banks saw the short-term profits from their increased risk-taking, but what they did led to greater vulnerability and less resilience. Short-termism is, of course, a fundamental characteristic of market economies, and especially economies such as that of the U.S. that focus on short-term shareholder value maximization. One example of diversity is the fact that in Europe, in Germany, for instance, there is another model of the corporation, which is called stakeholder value, which worries about all the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. The excessive focus on shareholder value maximization and the resulting short-termism in our economy is a fundamental flaw in our economic system. Regulators were supposed to curb these risks, but free market advocates never understood this, and regulators, especially before 2008, didn't understand this or its implications. They too were short-sighted, enjoying a short-term prosperity for which they claimed falsely partial credit, even as the economy became more vulnerable and less resilient. One aspect of this reduction in resilience is linked with a lack of diversity. In the past, differential financial institutions did different things. With the repeal of what is in the United States called the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated investment banking from commercial banking. Investment banks are supposed to manage the risks of wealthy people, and commercial banks accepted the deposits of ordinary individuals. And before the Clinton administration, these were separated, but then under the influence, particularly of Citibank, that barrier was brought down, and the banking got increasingly concentrated. But not only did banking get increasingly concentrated, and so the too big to fail problems got worse, but there developed what might be called groupthink about the right strategy to pursue. Banks were engaged in more similar activities. They all jumped on the same bandwagon involving lending into the housing bubble, securitization, derivatives, CDSs, exploiting consumers, predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, market manipulation, the list goes on. They all had similar risk models. They all persuaded shareholders that they were onto the right thing, and shareholders punished any bank that deviated. The one or two CEOs when the housing bubble came to an end, almost all of them went into crisis, and we had a financial crisis. If there had been more diversity, our financial system would have been more robust. In the years since the crisis, we have increased resilience by increasing buffers, by strengthening regulations. Though under President Trump, the Republicans are engaged in an attempt to roll all of this back and reduce resilience. But little has been done to increase diversity. And if we don't do more, our financial system will remain vulnerable and will lack resilience. I want to emphasize one aspect that I have already discussed. If the participants in the financial system had a long-term perspective, they would have understood all of this. The economic system, in one way or another, would have rewarded resilience and diversity. But there is an insufficient appreciation of the value of resilience and diversity, a lack of understanding of the sources of vulnerability, and the consequences of the lack of diversity. In recent years, these problems that I've just highlighted have become worse for two reasons. First is the increase in complexity of our economic system. Increases in complexity might be thought of as a great achievement. We introduce more complexity as we try to solve one or another difficult problem. As our computational and organizational abilities increase, as one legal or regulatory problem leads to another. The problem is that complex systems are harder to understand. We've created systems that are so complex that the full workings of which no one fully comprehends. Research in financial networks over the past 2 decades has shown that more complex systems can be more vulnerable and are harder to regulate. It is even difficult, if not essentially impossible, to tell whether they exhibit systemic fragility. And the second increasing problem is that markets have become increasingly short-term. The benefits of greater resilience and diversity are manifest in the long run. There's often a cost, as I said before, in the short term. It is costly to make systems that are more resilient. Short-term profit seekers ignore the long-term benefits of resilience as they focus on the short-term benefits of living on the edge. Short-term politicians ignore the long-term benefits of having greater resilience and diversity as they deregulated and receive the praise of short-term profit-maximizing banks. As a society, we have to keep a view on the long term, though our political and economic systems militate against doing so. In other arenas, the pursuit of short-term gains has resulted in an increase in vulnerability and a reduction in resilience. And now I want to explore a couple of other examples that probably you'll discuss, some of these you'll discuss in the coming days. Consider first national security. I thought it was a big mistake when Germany became so dependent on Russian gas. We'll pass over for the moment the more than a sniff of corruption in the process, with the former Chancellor of Germany taking a well-paid position in Gazprom. Dependence on a single source of fuel makes one more vulnerable. It is hard to be resilient in the face of a cutoff of the supply or a dramatic increase in the price. At the same time, politics may have made that look unlikely. At the time, politics may have made that look unlikely, but these are long-term decisions. Resilience requires adversity of sources of suppliers or supplies that one can access at any time. And here, there's a fundamental difference between gas and oil. Gas that comes through pipeline, oil through many different sources. So if you're cut off from your supply of oil, you can find another source. But if Russia were to decide to cut off supply of gas, there is no way in the short term that one could make up for a shortfall. And while I worried about this at the beginning as a theoretical possibility, we've seen with the interruption of the supply in Ukraine a couple of years ago that this is not only a theoretical possibility, it's a reality. It is a reality that has not only economic consequences, but political consequences. The ability, the willingness to stand up to Russia as it engaged in taking over eastern Ukraine is affected, obviously, when you have an economic dependence on another country. Or consider the problem of ecosystems. Just like the economy, which is always being buffeted by shocks, so too the ecosystem. As in the economy, many of these shocks are generated by the system itself, viruses that arise and are successful in attacking one species or another. Indeed, our very system of evolution and genetic variation gives rise to these possibilities. But lack of diversity within a species makes the entire species vulnerable and reduces its resilience. If one member of the species is unable to overcome the shock, others will too. And the same argument holds more generally as we consider biodiversity. That's one of the reasons that preserving biodiversity is so important. Now, I've been told that this is an issue even here in the outskirts of Alpbach, where a lack of diversity in the trees means that an attack, a virus or a disease that affects one of these trees could affect all of them. And there is less resilience of the system because of the lack of diversity. Just as short-term economic incentives result in inadequate attention to economic diversity, it has paid insufficient attention to biodiversity. There is a global biodiversity agreement, but under the influence of our short-term profit-maximizing drug companies, the U.S. has refused to sign the biodiversity agreement. Much of the global biodiversity occurs in poor countries. They are being asked to maintain that biodiversity, which is a global public good, without compensation. I think this is morally wrong, and it won't work. They have to be incentivized to do so. Of growing concern, similarly, is the resilience of our food chain, with the reduction in diversity of varieties, and the role particularly of Monsanto and GMOs in resulting in lack of diversity in the basic food stock. The discussion of the importance of resilience and diversity in environmental and ecological context obviously brings me to what I think is the most important environmental issue, and that is climate change. This is an issue of an existential threat to our world. And so far, we have not really done enough of what we should do to create a resilient economic and environmental system. Of course, I think one should begin, as I did the economic analysis, to talk about reduce the risk of the shock. In other words, reduce the risk of climate change. Resilience requires a diversity of approaches, not just one approach. And that's because we are uncertain about which approach is going to work. And we will probably need everything, every approach that we can bring to bear. So we need particularly to focus on renewables. The atmosphere can only absorb so much greenhouse gases, and we are reaching the limit of what it can absorb. And so we will have to rely almost entirely on renewables. And so we have to explore how do we get wind, solar, but it's not just the issue of the generation of electricity. We have to redesign our cities to make our cities resilient, to create efficient cities. And we have to create with these efficient cities good public transportation systems. The reliance on the car will not work. And even though we talk about electric cars, the fact is electric cars use electricity. And that electricity has to be generated somewhere. And so in the end, we have to use our, create systems that use less electricity, and that means a reliance on public transportation. So not only do we have to have a diversity of approaches to addressing the problem of emissions, we have to use a diversity of instruments. I think the most important instrument is a carbon price. And there's been a reluctance to use that. Sweden has introduced it. Macron says he will, but so far hasn't. And other countries need to do so. But we also need to use regulatory systems. There shouldn't be any coal-fired generating plants built anymore. And we need public expenditures, for instance, for public transport. And as the world faces this existential threat, we be reducing the public sector. It is something that will require a larger and larger public expenditure to prevent this crisis, which is a fundamental public crisis. Resilience will mean that we will have to begin to prepare for the climate change that will occur. The amount of carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere has baked in significant climate change. Almost surely we will face an increase in temperature of more than 2 degrees centigrade. The good news is that the rise in the sea level will mean Wall Street will probably be underwater. But that is probably not as, because the rest of us will have to bear the cost of Wall Street moving somewhere else. So even the benefit, a little benefit that we thought for a moment might come from climate change will prove elusive. The final example I want to talk about is very much in the spirit of what Dr. Fischler talked about a minute ago. And it's the danger to societal resilience that arises from the lack of diversity in our ideas and our ideologies. I talked before about the consequences of groupthink in the financial sector. It led to a lack of diversity and a lack of resilience so exhibited in 2008. In the last 40 years, a set of economic ideas have predominated in much of the West, ideas called neoliberalism or market fundamentalism. The idea was just leave it to the market will solve all problems. Actually, economic theory never supported that idea. And the big irony was that exactly when those ideas were becoming popular, in the late 70s, early 80s, research in economics showed that they were fundamentally wrong. My own work in the economics of information showed that Adam Smith had said that the pursuit of self-interest, profit maximization on the part of firms would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. Adam Smith, of course, understood that that was not really true, and he warned about the dangers of firms getting together to be monopoly and how conspiring to hurt workers, and he talked about all the dangers, but at that one moment he said that he was really highlighting the virtues of the price system. But if we look around, it's very clear. The reason the invisible hand often seems so invisible is that it's not there. That the pursuit of self-interest by the banks didn't lead to the well-being of our society, but led to the largest financial crisis in 75 years. The pursuit of self-interest may have led Volkswagen to think that it could monkey around with the emissions standards and most of the other auto companies, but it doesn't lead to the well-being of our society as the dirty cars pollute our atmosphere. If we hadn't had government regulations, our air would be unbreathable. We need those regulations actually just to survive. So the idea that of market fundamentalism, neoliberalism, just at the time that it was becoming fashionable, it was becoming clear that it was not a viable, an idea that made any sense. But it had enormous traction. There were special interests who benefited from these ideas. There were corporations who Volkswagen would have liked to be able to pollute us and to shorten our lifespan by the pollution that resulted from what they were doing. The banks enjoyed robbing the poor through their predatory lending, even if it led eventually to a global financial crisis. Well, the idea of the market fundamentalists was that liberalization, privatization, globalization, deregulation would lead to prosperity for all. Too many countries went down the same route with the same consequences. It failed. There is growing inequality, lack of opportunity. Again, Dr. Fischel talked about the importance of opportunity as part of diversity. In the United States, we see that problem most vividly. And in some ways, the United States is part of the diversity. It shows what happens if you go really, really wrong. It's an example of what not to do, because we have succeeded in creating the advanced country with the greatest level of inequality and among the lowest levels of opportunity. And the result of this is not only an economic disaster, it is a political disaster, and unfortunately, it's a political disaster not only for the United States, but for the world. It has predictably, as I talked about in my book, The Price of Inequality, led to political alienation. And I believe it is leading in the United States to the growth of fascism. It's a hard thing to say, but anybody who looks at the similarity between what happened in Europe in the 1930s and what is happening in the United States cannot be struck by the similarity. And in the United States, people are reading up on what happened in the 30s and seeing in what happened in the 30s examples, insights. For instance, fascists never got more than 20-30% of the votes. But there was complicity in one form or another from conservative interests, from business interests, that put them over the top and led them to take over the governments in country after country. And we see this in the United States. I saw it so vividly in Davos in January, where the corporate interests, the CEOs, the leaders of the world, were out there celebrating a tax cut for the corporations and the billionaires, a tax bill that, when it's fully implemented, will raise taxes on the vast middle class of the United States, the country where already inequality has grown out of bounds. A tax bill that resulted in 13 million more Americans not having health insurance in a country where life expectancy is on decline. Believe it or not, life expectancy in the United States is in decline, not because we don't have good research. We have the best researchers, including at Columbia University. Advances of knowledge, but we aren't giving the fruits of that research to the American people. It is the one country of the advanced countries that doesn't recognize the right of access to health care. But in European countries, that basic right is being attacked. Conservatives in England are undermining the National Health Service, and the issues are here in Austria and in other countries as well. So as we look around, and as I was at Davos, what was so striking was that these corporate titans, the leaders, never mentioned Trump's misogyny, his racism, his building the wall, his attack against Mexicans, his attack against the press, never mentioned once as they celebrated the cuts in their taxes. And that kind of cooperation is exactly what Paxton writes about in his very nice book called The Anatomy of Fascism, which is getting a lot of attention in the United States as we face what we view as a crisis. Well, fortunately, there is some diversity. Some countries have shown there is another way, a more successful path with higher growth, higher standards of living, greater security, and we can learn from all of them. The same pattern of excessive reliance on a single model has happened in development. The Washington Consensus was a set of ideas, a consensus between 15th Street in Washington and 19th Street in Washington, not a consensus within Washington or in the global community, and it led to low growth, high volatility, failure. East Asia showed that there was another model. Diversity is essential for progress as well as for resilience. Private and social incentives are often misaligned. Private focuses on the short-term benefits to firms or individuals. The social benefits focus on the long-term benefits to all of society. These are benefits that accrue to a more open society, one which is more open to a diversity of ideas. Today, as we continue the Enlightenment project of advancing our societal understanding of the world around us and how to organize society better, there is a virus that is attacking us. It is the virus of misinformation and an attack on our truth-telling institutions. It is a virus seen most vividly in the U.S. As our president and his party attacks all of our central truth-telling institutions, the media, our universities, judiciary, our scientific institutions. It is an attack on our epistemology, how we ascertain truth. One of the parties in the United States has been infested with this virus and is eating it away. It has been as successful as it has because of the lack of diversity of thought within that party, where climate denying and an attack on science align with special interests with an anti-government, anti-regulatory agenda. It is too soon to assess its resilience or indeed even that of the country. But what is clear is that that party is paying a high price for its failure to support more openness and transparency. So this is my final thought. An open society with a diversity of ideas will be a more resilient society. Our challenge today is to ensure the preservation and enhancement of this open society. It is under attack. There is a war going on. It is your future and the future of our civilization that is at stake. And you are and will be both the foot soldiers and the generals in this war. Thank you.
Before I forget, there was this young man outside in a blue jacket who lent me his lighter. You want it back? No? Okay. Maybe later then. I mean, it's scary waking up every day and reading the news and finding out what the next tweet was. And you just used some strong words to describe this scary situation in the US. And one of the recipes is making people not only think short term. Is that what you're recommending? I mean, you just had some, we said no recipes. We've heard that before, but.
Yeah, so obviously thinking long term, but I think.
How do you make people think long term?
Yeah, so I think we have to think all the ways that there is an attack on our institutions, understand how important they are, and then all the way that we fight back, both constructively and defensively. So institutions like this meeting here is a very good place, context, in which there's an exchange of ideas and kind of diversity coming to understand what is going on. I think understanding why we need to have a diversity, say, of think tanks. We have a lot of complex problems, and Europe has done a much better job, say, than the United States in providing public support for diverse sects of think tanks. I think giving support to the media. I mean, this is not meant to pander you,
yes,
but the fact is that having a diverse media so that you get a diversity of views. And
a public one as well.
Including public, exactly. Because what you see is you get a much, what we see most strongly is BBC, for instance. And what was so clear, for instance, take one example, a decade ago, during the Iraq War. The American media all played into Bush's Iraq War. And it was only the Financial Times and the BBC that were providing Americans with balanced coverage of what was going on.
So we just said, because you were talking about Gazprom, so one of the things that would help, like in business and political situation, is like a cooling off phase for politicians, or would that help?
Well, in the United States, probably we're most sensitive to the dangers posed by campaign finance, because that is the mechanism by which money has come to infuse our politics. And as I describe in my book, The Price of Inequality, America has morphed from a system of one person, one vote into $1, one vote. And you can't have a viable democracy based on $1, one vote. So to me, that's the most important. But the mechanisms by which money influences our political system are manifest. One of them is this, as you say, revolving door, and often where politicians get rewarded after work for things they do before. So you saw the Secretary of Treasury who was involved in the repeal of Glass-Steagall wound up being at Citibank. So, these are... Surprisingly, and it was Citibank that was the biggest beneficiary of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. So, and this is where an active press is really important, to expose these and to make people sensitive to them. And I think if there were more, visibility to it, that there's some self-control, at least, and this also has to do with societal norms, that become accepted that people do this.
what else is he or she going to do, right?
Yeah, and we ought to think of, no, that shouldn't be acceptable.
So if we think about states and them countries wanting to be resilient, or let's say even like a format of countries like the European Union versus the states, or both, or within that, it seems to me sometimes as if there is like a competition of resilience in which the US president says the US first, right?
Well, I think, first, one of the fundamental failures of Trump is to see everything as a zero sum. So
there's a cake and you can have this
different
piece and then
slices,
it's done, right?
and the basic lesson of economics is there are lots of benefits from cooperation. So it isn't a question of one country first and everybody else. Cooperation is really absolutely essential. The obvious example, I've talked about climate change. That's a global, what we call global public good. If we don't all work at it, we'll all suffer. And you won't solve that problem without the cooperation of everybody. But, you know, speaking about Trump's U.S. first, you probably saw some of the cartoons that originated all over Europe of people saying,
Sweden first, Austria first. Yeah, we had that.
That was one.
Yeah.
The other one where people were setting out little cartoons saying Sweden second, or they were competing to be second, and they were joking about the idea that they would be the second. And the other one, a couple of things. We were down in Rome, and on the City Hall, they had a big banner. It was something like, Trump has already, put America first. And the banner said, put the world first, put the planet first. And I think that's really the right idea. You have to put the world in the context of climate change, put the planet first.
I know you're just finishing your new book. Would you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, there are two strands of, when you say big ideas. The first is that if you look at the history of of our standards of living, until about 1750, 1800, there were no changes in standards of living. You drew it wrong. The best of our data, real wages were constant. And then beginning in 1750, 1800, they started really to rise very rapidly. And natural question is, what is the source of that increase? And it's the Enlightenment. And what was it about the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment was systematic ways of discovering about the nature of our universe, to understand it and therefore to control it, and then systematic ways of organizing society, rule of law, checks and balances, all these basic principles of societal organization, which also meant how you have an interplay between science and how these ideas of science are brought into society. So the first basic idea is that those fundamentals are really under attack now by Trump, as I talked about in my talk. That the bases of learning, knowledge, are under attack, and the bases of our organization of society, checks and balances, rule of law, have really been under attack. And our truth-telling institutions are under attack. And that's why, the irony is that if we were successful, it would be a return to the Middle Ages, to a world before the Enlightenment. And so, while we talk about various policies, the trade war, this policy or another, what is at really at stake is much greater than those particular policies. It's an understanding of what has been the source of our prosperity and what these ultra-right, and not just, I mentioned Trump, but all the ultra-right, is really an attack on what has brought us the kind of prosperity that we have over the last 200 years. The second idea is that one of the things that has made the market economy successful is the idea of competition. And one of our basic values, a set of values, are related to democracy that I talked about before. Well, what's been happening is, in the United States most strongly, but elsewhere, the growth of market power, a weakening of the power of workers. You see it in the rearrangement of collective bargaining arrangements. You see it in weakening of labor legislation in countries all over the world, lack of compensation for overtime hours, all kinds of things. So the result of this is one of the big causes of inequality on the one hand, but the other side of that is this agglomeration of market power is a major contributing to inequality. The growth of inequality inevitably means an attack on democracy. Because when you have the extremes of inequality in the United States, and are growing in many parts of Europe, those at the top are going to use their money to undermine democracy. And they'll use ideology, they'll use arguments.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes, because they are afraid that individuals understand that you need high taxes to make sure you have good public transport, fight global climate change, have basic standards of living, good healthcare systems. You need these basic, which are part of our civilization and part of our standards of living. And the people at the top don't need that. They can send their kids to private schools. They can buy the best private health care. So they don't need any of these things. And so they would rather have, out of their selfishness, and I think foolish selfishness, because if you look in Latin America, you see what happens when you get to you live in gated communities, you have insecurity, but they don't see that long-term vision. All they see is they want to get more for themselves.
So let me guess what the title of that book is. Trump, Brexit, let me give you the big picture, or what is it?
Well, I don't say it quite that way. It's about power, politics, and profits, and how to save capitalism from itself.
Okay. Joseph Stiglitz, thank you so much for coming and opening the European Forum Alpbach 2018. Please. Now we'll dive back into a time that Franz Fischler was already talking about. 104 years ago, the First World War begun. And we're talking about Karl Kraus's The Last Days of Mankind and the amazing Austrian artist Deborah Sengel. And her reaction, her oeuvre with 200 stuffed white rats. And the curator of this exhibition is here as well, and he will introduce the exhibition to you. His name is Günther Oberhollenzer, and please give him a very warm welcome now.
Einen wunderschönen guten Abend, good evening. I'm delighted to be a guest in Alpbach tonight and to say a few words about Deborah Sengel's outstanding work. This extraordinary exhibition was conceived in 2014 for the Essel Museum in Klosterneuburg near Vienna, and after displayed in Carencia, in Bratislava and Tirana, now it can be seen at Forum Alpbach. In this masterpiece, the Austrian artist combines history, literature, and contemporary art in an extraordinary way. She uses white rats to stage scenes from The Last Days of Mankind, a play by the important Austrian writer Karl Kraus. 100 years ago, the First World War was still in full swing, and probably no other literary work captured the atmosphere of the time and the inhumanity and absurdity of the war as concisely, as precisely The Last Days, written between 1915 and 1922. With literary wit, Kraus describes the whole industry of violence and destruction, the physical and moral damage, and exposes a large number of camp followers and profiteers, incendiary journalists, and military sadists. With unique creative flair, Sengel engages with the text of Kraus and reinterprets excerpts from the scenes and dialogues. She uses well over 100 stuffed white rats to stage over 40 individual scenes from the play, accompanied by drawings. We both observe from the outside and document what we see, says Sengel about her relationship to Kraus. I actually only even depict what I experience, what I see in our time, in our society. I'm not making anything up. The same applies to the writer. The Last Days are mainly a collection of quotations and statements collated to a large extent from newspaper articles of the time. Sengel sees her work as a free, creative interpretation of the play by Kraus, in which she has discovered a great deal that seems to fit our current area. Also, the work dates back 100 years, says Sengel. It still feels contemporary to me. We may not have war in our immediate vicinity, but war within us is still as strong, if not stronger, than it was then. And I would add, at the present time, we witness more and more people playing with fire, with the threat of war, with the incitement of hatred, fear, and violence. One of the strengths of Kraus' work in Sengel's visual interpretation lies in the fact that only very few scenes show the horrors of the war front. The focus is not on the battlefields. The events often take place away from the theaters of war. There are scenes of everyday life, often set in Vienna in public spaces, in offices or coffee houses. War begins in the mind on a small scale. Whether in school, in a brothel, or at the front, war affects every area of life. But the work also reveals the blind enthusiasm of the individual, the vanity and overconfidence of the warmongers, the lies and manipulated power of the media, the selfish plotting of the war profiteers, but also the general denial of reality in face of even increasing horror and impending defeat. Sengel transforms this enormous word power of Kraus' text into images that are wordless, but not less expressive for it. Her images are not illustrations of Kraus' work. This is a work of art in its own right. It does not require the text. Where Kraus uses words, Sengel uses visuals. Her works translate the animal character of human being into images. It did not take long the artist to decide she wanted to use rats, as their egoism is very similar to that of humans. Moreover, Kraus looked at humanity as if it played out in a laboratory. Sengel explains her choice with white rats with the fact that she did not want to create hierarchies or evaluations by using different colors. According to Kraus, everyone bears some of the blame for the war. The soldiers who do the killing, but also the propaganda press or the civilians who do not resist, who simply repeat the opinions of the others. Kraus even blames himself in the final scene. Nevertheless, Sengel has decided to make the grumbler Kraus appear as a black rat, since he is the outside observer who looks what is happening from the outside. The artist worked closely with a taxidermist and designed flags and newspapers, furniture and other objects as heads or jewelry to bring the protagonist to life and make the individual scenes recognizable and readable. The props are also white, but in isolated scenes, blood, urine, or alcohol appears as colorful stylistic devices to make it clear that horror is increasingly breaking into everyday life and soiling the purity. In selecting the scenes, the artist tried to put together a cross-section of the play's different settings. The range includes streets and administrative offices, a war hospital, and the horrors at the war front. By letting different strata of the population speak, from military commanders to so-called subscribers and patriots who represent the common people, Krauss invests his work with a great deal of reality. Sengel, on the other hand, creates distance and irritates by portraying people with threats. In her paintings, drawings, and sculptures, the artist often transfers general human issues to the animal kingdom. I use the animal as a metaphor, says Sengel, because I think one distracts the viewers when one shows people. The animal becomes the representative for a human trait, for a form of action, for a certain way of behaving. According to Niklas Luhmann, art is supposed to make the unobservable observable. It creates a second reality that allows us to view the world from a different perspective. According to Luhmann, art can never merely observe and exhibit the world, but it must contribute to create distance and accept. And we see ourselves. In Krauss' play, there's the distressing scene of a patient who is presented to a high-ranking medical committee. This one is crazy, even insane, says the committee members. It's a pretty clear case of mental illness. The reason for this diagnosis, the patient has doubts about the truth of the official war reports, and he's fundamentally opposed to war. In my opinion, artists like Karl Kraus or Deborah Sengel are the crazes of our world. They keep their clear, critical view when times get foggy and share their findings with us, the readers and viewers. What Sengel has created here is bold undertaking. The work is not uncontroversial, but she has managed to create a truly extraordinary way and view of Kraus' work, and she let us rediscover its topicality. The world of yesterday is the world of today. Deborah Sengel and I belong to a generation that was fortunate enough to not have experienced war in Europe. We know it only from stories told by the grandparents and from history textbooks. But we do live in a time of change, similar to the beginning of the 20th century, in a time of rapid technological, but also social, cultural and political changes, in a world that is transforming incredibly quickly, a world that experiences great destabilizing forces. In 1914, the result was war. At the time, hardly anyone was aware of the catastrophic consequences it would have for the 20th century. Yes, today we are confronted with problems which we must take seriously. But when the fundamental principles of the European unification are challenged by populists, when nationalism is getting stronger and walls are built, we should be aware that all the enormous privileges we have in Europe, such as democracy, freedom, and human rights, are fragile achievements that might disappear again. They are a gift. With their work, Karl Kraus and Deborah Sengel can help us understand this. Thank you. And Deborah Sengel, please join me now at the stage.
something, so let me quickly say it. There's a book signing if you want, not the new book, not yet. That's coming out, I think, in February, but the other books that Joseph Stiglitz wrote, you can have them signed, I think, in like 15 minutes, because there's a short interview in between, in the second floor. And at 7 o'clock, you can come back here, and then you're going to be presented all the seminars. So thank you very much. Sorry for saying this now.